Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. My name is Dr. Brian Rade. I'm a naturopathic doctor. And today I'm going to be joined by Carrie B. Wellness. That's her handle on Instagram and other social media platforms. And Carrie B talks about a lot of fascinating topics related to mitochondrial function, the importance of getting a light exposure, the importance of the quality of the water that we consume and the water inside of our bodies, and just a lot of really cool biohacking things that apply to really anyone in the general populace. But in as it relates to folks with complex chronic illness, there are the essentially my take home message from what I've seen on her social media posts and whatnot are things that we can that patients can apply to their cases to help kind of complement some of the other things that we're working on, like killing infections, detoxifying mold, things to that effect. So Carrie B will be joining me in just a second. Just before we jump into the interview, I just want to quickly mention, if you're not already on my mailing list, please consider jumping on that mailing list. There's a link to join in the show notes of the podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link in the description below. If you join my mailing list, you'll get access to the first two parts of my Overcoming Chronic Illness course at no cost. It's a course that basically is a very deep dive into all of the, in my opinion, the major, most important topics to consider when folks are navigating the waters of complex chronic illness. So just a little plug for that. Again, free to anyone who signs up on my newsletter. Plus, you'll be on my newsletter and just get to hear my weekly, musings and just updates about things that are happening with my practice, things I'm excited about with treatments for patients and things like that. So without further ado, I shall pause the recording here for just 1 sec, and I'll be right back with Carrie B. All right, everyone. So I'm joined now by Carrie Bennett, also known as Carrie B. Wellness. So thank you so much for joining me today, Carrie. And would you mind just giving the listeners a little overview of who you are and what you're all about with your clinical offerings?
Oh, thanks, Brian. I'm excited to chat with you today. Sure. So my clinical offerings have actually varied substantially, kind of as I've evolved in what I think my clients really benefit from, right? And so if you throw me back 20 years, I'm a personal trainer, right? I graduate from undergrad with the biology degree, and I'm supposed to go to get a PhD or a doctor, right? I'm supposed to be an MD or a PhD, and none of that really rang true for me. And so I was an athlete my whole life. And I also had this mental breakdown and said, I don't want to do those. Like that just doesn't vibe with me. And so I actually decided at that point to go into massage therapy school. I had the coolest parents. They were so supportive, but it was basically like, yeah, get a job, put yourself through massage therapy school. Let's see where it goes. So I became a personal trainer as that job, to go through massage therapy school. And a couple of cool things happened with that. Number one, I opened a little studio. I started really working with clients one-on-one in personal training only, which was super cool because it was my passion at the time. And I got to view the body from a completely different perspective than I did in undergrad, more of an Eastern philosophy of acupressure points and how energy flows and how we can get stuck and stagnant through the massage therapy program. So it was like a really cool little shift of, okay, I'm working with people and their bodies in a clinical setting, if you will, as a personal trainer, but wow, this is neat. This is different. And I want to kind of go a little bit more into that. But, just trying to, improve my business and offering people massage, offering people personal training, it was great. But then people started coming to me, and it's just like, I've got this chronic fatigue, or I just can't get over this, these migraines, all these chronic migraines. And I was like, wait a second, you mean there's more to this than like exercise and massage? And then I given my own health journey, I call it an opportunity, where after the birth of my first child, Luke, I all of a sudden developed debilitating fatigue, horrible stomach pains, you name it. It was just the symptoms of what people told me. Oh, you're a new mom. That's what it's supposed to feel like. You're supposed to be tired all the time, feel bloated, have no energy, inflamed. And I was just like, I don't buy into it. And so I went back to school at that point to get a master's degree in clinical nutrition, which was cool. Another whole way to view the body, right, through the lens of nutrition. And so I started applying some of this additional information I had learned, and it moved the needle a little bit, but I still wasn't feeling great, right? I still wasn't feeling great. I still had like this feeling of I could take a nap at any moment, and I need that nap at any moment. Then that was during the day. And then this weird aspect at night of I'm physically tired, but I'm wired. I'm getting this second wind. I can't shut it down. What's going on? And that's when I discovered the work of Dr. Jack Kruse and dove down a rabbit hole of what light is doing to my body. What light am I under throughout the day and how it's influencing my energy, metabolism, even my sleep, right? My ability to recover. And as I started to apply that to my life, and then also in these clinical settings, that was what really was foundational in moving my health journey forward. And so that's where I love to start clients these days. While I do think nutrition and movement and massage and other modalities are super important, I like to lay what I call the foundation of light and quantum health strategies. So I guess these days I do call myself a quantum clinician, if that's a thing, because I want people to recognize that there's another layer. It should be, right? Because there's another layer that we could maybe view the body and how we can be supportive in people's health journeys.
That's amazing. That's a great backstory. And just for folks who aren't familiar with Dr. Jack Kruse, when you're saying that you went down a rabbit hole, like I'm trying to think of like what's like, I don't know, like the biggest hole, like it's like the Grand Canyon, basically. Like
it's a huge hole.
I spent like months going through like all of his online articles, watching videos, like, oh my gosh, he's got so much content, and like just gets into, he's a neurosurgeon.
He's a neurosurgeon.
Yeah. So like just gets right deep into it. So anyways, yeah, no, he's a great mentor. That's awesome. And as I didn't know that Jack Kruse had played a role in your development of everything you're teaching. It's like, oh, I can see a lot of the overlap there now, for sure. That's great. Well, I'd really like to talk about how these types of concepts apply to folks with complex chronic illness. But kind of before we get into that, if we could maybe talk about a little bit more foundational stuff. So on your, I was looking at your website and I see your kind of official website's kind of under development. So you sort of have this link tree on your Instagram, which has all of your course offerings and things like that. And so I thought maybe a good framework to kind of just make sure that we kind of get listeners up to speed on some of the foundational elements of what types of things you talk about is just kind of talking about sort of the general framework of or some of the general elements of your Quantum Foundations course. So you have this Quantum Foundations, light, water, electrons, and mitochondrial healing course, which the outline for it looks awesome, covers a lot of ground, which is great. And so I'm wondering if we can just, again, I can ask you a few questions around each of those kind of major topics. So the first question is, what would be, say, the biggest 1 to 3 takeaways from the light part of your course? Which I'm sure there's probably dozens of takeaways, but what would be sort of one of the one or two or three of the biggest takeaways?
Sure. Yeah, light is really key for us to start off with, and that's why I lay it first in this course, because we are beings that respond to light signaling in a lot of different ways. Light, I think this word is much more common now than it was 10 years ago, but our circadian rhythm, right? That human beings have a circadian rhythm. And in fact, every living creature on this planet has a circadian rhythm. And what that means foundationally is that we've been tuned into light cycles. We know that every 24 hours, there's a certain period of light and a certain period of darkness. And in order to optimize our physiology, because we have 100,000 tasks happening in every single cell, every single second. And so in order to coordinate this really complex being that I am, we've cued into certain signals. So it would make no sense for me to be running programs that my body would want to do like deep tissue repair, which would happen at sleep, right? That'd be wasteful. Likewise, it'd be really silly for me to have my digestion running all like digestive juices being produced all night long when I probably am not going to be consuming any food. And so if the human body has been studied to recognize that we do have these circadian tasks that happen on a daily basis, but it cues into light and the colors of light that are coming to me from my environment. And so I really like to lay the foundation that whatever location I'm in, the sun is going to start to lighten the sky. And as it does it starts to brighten and intensify and layer on different colors, just as we would see light split through a prism or through a rainbow. And so what we're never really taught is that those colors, the ratios, the intensities, the colors that come to us very predictably all day long. And so it's this change in this layering of colors that, number one, starts with what I would call my circadian rhythm. It starts my body recognizing it's daytime. Carrie's no longer in deep tissue repair mode. She's no longer encoding memories. She's awake. She's in day mode. And then based on the colors that get layered, kind of different programs get kicked off, right? Get activated. And so that morning sunlight is really key. I tell people, in order to kind of tell your body that it's daytime, you have to get outside around sunrise. Get that sunrise light into your eyes, because that kicks off your circadian clock. So the light that's there has this beautiful blend of red and blue and infrared. And those colors actually communicate through your eyes to a clock in your brain called your suprachiasmatic nucleus. And that clock will literally coordinate every cell in your body, because every cell in our body has clock genes that are based on specific timing mechanisms. So they need to know the time of day in order to, let's say, make this protein versus not make that protein. And so we kind of start that mechanism off with sunrise light. So that's a key thing that I like people to look at, is making sure you're getting some morning light to be able to start your circadian day. But then if you look at it from the other perspective, we also have to then, after sunset, when certain light frequencies that would have kept us awake and alert, specifically blue light frequencies, when those go away from our environment, we have to make sure that we potentially artificially also keep the blue light from entering our eyes and communicating that it's still daytime, so we can go into that repair mode at night. So, really getting to understand that we optimize different functions for daytime versus nighttime, and that we have to keep those signals strong based on the light that we allow into our eyes or we don't allow into our eyes at night, so that we can actually run the programs we're designed to run.
That's great. A couple of follow-up questions to that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So as I certainly, I know in your social media posts, you talk about this a lot because it's super important. I've heard some other very smart people also talk about this quite a lot. I just feel like I get hit over the head time and time again of like, oh yeah, like make sure you do your early morning like light gazing, stay away from that artificial light. Thankfully I have a wife who's a very, very big fan of yours, by the way. It's like, oh, I'm interviewing Carrie B, and she's like, oh my gosh, like, anyways, she was very excited. So you got a big fan here in Nova Scotia,
Yay.
and my wife. But one of the things that I haven't really heard a whole lot of discussion about, maybe delve into this in your course, but say a person's, they have a busy schedule like many people do. What would be kind of the minimum amount of time that someone might want to, be gazing, getting some natural light into their eyes, say as early in the morning as possible?
At that sunrise light, what's really cool is you just have to get the stimulus to kind of kickstart the clock or kickstart the day.
Mm-hmm.
And once you do that for maybe 3 to 5 minutes, so it's not a long time,
Mm-hmm.
you just basically say, okay, it's morning, we're kicking off these processes. And then the hypothalamus kicks in and does what it does. It talks to the pituitary gland, it communicates to the adrenals, the ovaries, the thyroid, and you get a whole, you just have to kind of kickstart that cascade on a consistent basis. And so it's not a lot of time. It's just doing it consistently.
Great. So a person could drink their morning coffee while doing that, or do some stretches, or, try to multitask it if they are in a rush, and hopefully brush their teeth on their back porch, whatever it is.
Exactly. And,
Okay.
like right now in Michigan, the timing is such that for me, it's right after school drop off. So, I try to mitigate, headlights and stuff as much as possible. And then sometimes I'm literally in a parking lot and I'm just staring through the sunroof or through open windows, trying to catch those light signals. So it doesn't have to look like this perfect, 3-hour morning routine for it to be effective.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then just another follow-up question on this. So again, lots of folks out there, not lots, but a number of folks out there talking about the importance of this. I haven't really heard anybody talk about whether it's important or not to kind of get a little spot check of natural light through the day. Like I like the way it's great the way you explained it, how like just as the sun's rising in the horizon and all of that, and sending different blends of light rays onto us. I don't know, any thoughts, or do you know about like, oh, should you do this like every 2 hours if you could, just to get like, okay, now I have 10 a.m. light and noon light and 2 p.m. light, or
Sure.
is that asking a little too much? Or
No, it's a great question. And yeah, like, so here's what I've found clinically to be the most effective, right? It's in the morning is really when we have to almost front load our little light breaks. And then I have what I kind of call a circadian dead zone. And I guarantee you, we're going to find out in the next 30 years that there's important things happening there, right? But just from a clinical perspective, I find that sunrise time is really key. And then when UVA light starts to appear in your location, and that varies time of year based on where we are on the planet. And there's an app called Circadian app that will tell you in your location. So I've got clients download that app and I have them in that UVA window. I have them get another little hit of light. If it's 5 minutes, great. If they can take a phone call outside and it's 20 minutes, even better. And so if they can catch that UVA light, that's really special, because what that UVA light does is what I call it neurotransmitter magic. It starts to take these amino acids that are kind of still amino acids that make us feel a little bit calmer and groggier, and it converts them into feel-good chemicals in the brain. So for example, we got a lot of these amino acids in the backs of our eyes, and they're called aromatic amino acids. They kind of pool in our eyes and they're swimming through that blood. And what they're looking to do is the aromatic, because they take a funny little ring shape, or a really cool ring shape. And I don't think people, I never made this connection, Brian, studying anything in undergrad or grad school. I never made the connection that these are just molecules full of electrons that are waiting to be excited by light. So something that's important to understand is that light excites electrons and gives them almost like a burst of energy to then become something else, to kind of continue down this biochemical pathway. And it just so happens that these aromatic amino acids, phenylalanine, tyrosine, tryptophan, they're waiting for that UVA light because it's an intense enough wavelength of light. So once those amino acids get that UVA hit of light, then they can become, for example, tyrosine can become dopamine. Tryptophan can become serotonin. Phenylalanine can become noradrenaline or norepinephrine. Like all of these neurochemicals that actually make us feel good and curious and motivated and focused throughout our day. So, I get clients who kind of feel like they live in zombie land because they don't necessarily, indoor light doesn't have this, right? So they're never getting this stimulus to take these aromatic amino acids and actually make them into really powerful brain chemicals that make us more productive and motivated and enjoying our day. So UVA is a really key time. I also say if you have UVB and you can make vitamin D, that's another 5 to 15 minute hit of time outside, because then if you can make some vitamin D through your skin, not only are you making the vitamin D that we test in blood, or there's sometimes 2 metabolites we test in blood, you're actually making about 50 to 100 metabolites that we don't realize are really just as equally as important as the vitamin D, the 25 or the 125 itself. So yeah, those are key times. And so I tell people, if you can kind of take those little breaks and then say from after you do that morning vitamin D, if you really need to sit down and do stuff indoors, you got about 3 hours there. Like, go ahead, get inside. And then, it's also kind of nice and soothing to get outside in the evening to acknowledge that the day is waning, stuff is shutting down. And that's when we would also ultimately, at darkness, block that artificial light so that we can allow our body to get into that regeneration mode. But anytime we go outside, we're literally syncing right up because the colors are different. So we're getting the timing mechanism really on point and synced up anytime we can get outside.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm going to download that Circadian app later today. So that's awesome. I did not know most of that. So thank you for that. That's great.
Sure.
And I'm sure, a lot of folks listening, either personally or have heard other folks say like, yeah, I'm taking my vitamin D all winter, but like, man, when it comes, like, especially those that we were talking before we started recording, how we've been, you being in Michigan, I'm in Nova Scotia, we've had pretty dark winter so far, shorter days, all that. Folks will say like, when that sunlight comes out, I just feel so much better. And it's like, yeah, probably because there's not 50 metabolites in that vitamin D bottle. It's just your plain old vitamin D. That's it. So
exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. Just out of curiosity, kind of on topic but off topic, are you familiar with photodynamic therapy?
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So just reminded me a lot of that when you're talking about the aromatic amino acid activation, where it's like, yeah, just this beautiful, like, just give us some more electrons and the form of light, and it activates these molecules.
Exactly.
Would you mind speaking to photodynamic therapy a little bit, just for folks who aren't familiar with it?
Well, sure. It's basically like this idea that chemicals, whether they're in our bodies themselves or we can take certain chemicals exogenously, that you can amplify their effect when you're also exposed to light at the same time. So photo light dynamic, kind of this synergistic action that happens here. And one of my favorite actually ones to talk about is methylene blue.
I
I've
thought
seen
you might say that.
some really cool progress for clients when they've incorporated methylene blue appropriately. So it's one that really, whether you use it methylene blue plus sunlight or methylene blue plus red light therapy, that's such a synergistic combo for the mitochondria.
That's great. I was going to ask you about methylene blue a little bit later on because I know you posted about it, and I think it's one of the coolest compounds out there. So folks who are taking methylene blue, if they're using, like when you're talking about red light therapy, like is that like a red light panel kind of thing,
Right.
like
Yeah.
something like that?
Yep,
So what
exactly.
what kind of things have you heard folks report from that? Like are they reporting better energy, or like what are the things they typically note?
Typically they will note, excuse me, better energy, mental clarity, and also sometimes a reduction in pain, right? Because if we can get those mitochondria to make more energy in a tissue, then you're going to start to see pain resolve itself, inflammation resolve itself. So those are the main things that I see.
Yeah, that's great. Well, moving on to the next topic in your Quantum Foundations course. So would you mind giving the listeners a quick overview of what easy water is?
My favorite topic of all time. So easy water stands for exclusion zone water, which was a term popularized by researcher Dr. Gerald Pollack, who wrote The Fourth Phase of Water. And so if you think about that title, you're like, fourth phase of water? I was only taught that water exists as a solid, a liquid, and a gas. And so what we have to recognize is that the water inside of our bodies, actually the majority of it isn't like a liquid like we would see swirling around in a glass. Yes, we've got liquid water in our blood. Yes, we've got liquid water in our lymphatic system. But the majority of the water that's found inside of our cells and just around our cells in the extracellular space is actually structured and organized into a consistency that's more of like a jello or a jelly like consistency. And so it's a fourth phase. It's kind of between a solid and a liquid. And so we call it a liquid crystalline state. And we say liquid crystalline state because if ever you were to look at, let's say you were to look at a diamond under a microscope, a molecular microscope, right? And you would see that all of the atoms are very much ordered and arranged. They're arranged in these really set patterns, repeating patterns. So that's the same thing that happens with water. Actually, if it's in water in a glass, H2O, it kind of sloshes around. Like, so this H2O molecule that's bonded to itself is going to all of a sudden kind of interact with this H2O molecule that's bonded to itself, but they switch partners. Like things like here and then there. It's kind of a random dance that happens. But that water inside of our cells, it organizes the H's and the O's into hexagons, into sheets of hexagons. So picture like a honeycomb look to it. And so it's just a bunch of H's and O's that are organized into these hexagonal, these sheets of hexagons. And this forms next to all biological surfaces, all hydrophilic or water-loving surfaces, which, Brian, you know this, they're everywhere, right? All throughout the cell, it's packed full of these hydrophilic surfaces. And so that means that H2O inside of the body, anytime it comes into contact with these surfaces, it structures itself into this kind of crystalline ordered state that still has some fluid and some flow. So it's a liquid. And as it does that, as it organizes itself into this structured state, if you were to do some chemistry math, you would count the H's and you'd count the O's and you'd be like, wait a second, it's no longer H2O, it's H3O2. And in order for it to form H3O2, it has to kick out a hydrogen. And so then you're like, wait a second, if it's H3O2 and it kicks out a hydrogen is basically just a proton. It's the simplest atom on the periodic table. It kicks out a positively charged hydrogen. Well, that means that instead of being neutral, like water in a glass with no net charge, it's got a negative charge to it. And that hydrogen doesn't just kind of fly away willy-nilly. That hydrogen proton stays right next to this exclusion zone water, this structured liquid crystalline water, stays right next to it. So now you have, next to all biological surfaces, a negatively charged area next to a positively charged area. When you stick electrodes and in microelectrodes into the positively charged area and the negatively charged area, you light a light bulb. So you've got potential energy. The water in our bodies forms a battery of potential energy that helps to unfold proteins for them to do their work. It helps to funnel electrons actually to where they might be needed. For example, into the mitochondria, which we know, which I'm sure we'll talk about at another point here. But yeah, once I realized that water in our bodies, that easy water, forms a battery of potential energy and has a negative charge, because the interior of my cells are meant to have a negative charge. Well, it means that if I'm depleting that negative charge, I've depleted my easy water, I've depleted my potential energy, that battery of energy. And there's things that we can do to support that and build it back up inside of us.
That's great. That's the best explanation of easy water I've ever heard. So
Thank you.
thank you for that. That was great. So take home for folks in case, you got lost at hexagonal shapes, was it very, very well explained, but I feel like if I didn't have hadn't been exposed to this before, I'd be like, oh, I might have got a little bit lost there.
Sure.
But no, it was a great explanation. So please re-listen if that, in case you got lost there as a listener. Big take home message is this is super, super, super important. So as we'll hopefully talk about right shortly, if you're open to it, there are certain things you can do to help that easy water be formed, and there are certain things that basically degrade that easy water or interfere with its ability to be formed. So pay attention to that, because this stuff is super, super important, on the deepest cellular level. Just before we kind of maybe start delving into that a little bit more, if you don't mind. So you've described what easy water is very thoroughly. So what's the importance of that easy water? You're talking about energy potential and this and that, which is great.
Sure.
But could you maybe explain how that would apply to okay, what would we be feeling as individuals if we have good amounts of easy water in our tissues versus low amounts in our cells?
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. So one of the things where someone has low easy water is actually tissue stiffness. It's some interesting research to dive into to recognize that in this particular area of research, they call it bound water, pet peeve, right? They call it a different thing depending on who's researching it. But they found that if you got someone who just always feels like they've got, oh, I'm always stiff, I've always got these nagging aches and things like that, their stiffness, that's an indication that you've got low easy water. So tissue stiffness is a common one, but so is just simply feeling puffy or bloated, because easy water is actually a little denser than regular water, quote unquote. And so if you've got a lot of what's called bulk water, typical liquid water, that's where you're going to feel puffy or almost a little bit extra edema and this buildup of bloat. And so that's another key right there, as is just, what's your energy status? Because not only does the easy water contribute directly to your body's energy and need for energy, but mitochondria make water, and mitochondria are also make ATP, another currency that can be used for energy and other things in the body. So if you're fatigued, if you're inflamed, both of those things really, brain fog, that's the mitochondrially dense part of the body, that if those are pretty much key tip-offs to me, that you do not either make enough water in your body, in your mitochondria, or you're depleted of that easy water.
Okay. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah.
And this is just a good time to remind everybody that we're just talking about things for informational purposes. None of this should be construed as medical advice. If you need medical advice, please talk to your healthcare provider to get that advice. So just kind of as a, for myself as a clinician or other clinicians that are listening. So, because fatigue, it's everything causes fatigue, right? So that doesn't narrow it down a whole lot. But I can certainly say from my own clinical experience, while I've had many patients with puffiness or stiffness, that's not as much of a universal symptom, shall we say, as fatigue. So that's really helpful to me as a clinician to kind of narrow that down a bit more. And as we'll talk about coming up shortly, a lot of just healthy lifestyle practices can oftentimes help with encouraging easy water or dissuading, interference with easy water formation. And so lo and behold, it's probably why folks will come in yeah, I'm just feel kind of puffy. And then they make some healthy lifestyle changes oh, I'm not puffy anymore. It's well, it might be all down to that easy water level. It's not suddenly, oh, my kidneys are working so much better or something like that, or my lymphatic system just started working better. It's no, that easy water is probably a big part of it based on what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Sort of on that note, is there, could you speak to a link between if there's one that's been established that you're aware of, between having good amounts of like appropriate amounts of easy water and lymphatic system flow or lymph congestion if you don't have enough easy water?
It's a great point. I've made some extrapolations simply because we know that exclusion zone water propels flow. And the study that showed that it's in a lab, but in a lab, you can kind of mimic what the inside of vessels have, like the substance that lines blood vessels, for example, or lymphatic vessels. You can kind of mimic that with a substance called Nafion. And so when a Nafion tube, a hollow Nafion tube, is set sideways into a bed of water, the water without any like initiation starts automatically flowing, and it will stay in a perpetual flow state. And so what we're finding is that this negatively charged exclusion zone helps to propel flow when it's liquid water or a liquid state that's being moved. And so that actually would explain why, if you think about it, in the capillaries, red blood cells are oftentimes larger than the capillaries themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like we would need a massive amount of blood pressure to push those red blood cells through. So something must be assisting. And so that's the theory behind it now, is that exclusion zone water is assisting flow both to get to the capillary and to kind of pull the red blood cell through the capillary and into the venous system. And so that's one thing. And so then there's more research that's being done on that. But my thought is, well, it's always puzzled me why the lymphatic system doesn't have a pump. Why doesn't it have something that moves it? And yeah, yes, we're meant to move our bodies to help with lymph flow, but I'm recognizing that as I help clients reestablish exclusion zone water levels in the body, I feel like their lymphatic drainage picks up massively. And so my thought is that the vessels of the lymphatic system must also work on this flow-based, exclusion zone water flow-based mechanism. So if we build easy water, actually we see improved blood flow. We also I've seen improved lymph flow as well.
That is awesome. And just
pretty
typing notes
cool.
here as you're going along here. So, yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And like just the other day, and on many occasions, I thought to myself, because I talk to patients about lymph flow all the time, and it's like, yeah,
Sure.
like your lymph doesn't really move a whole heck of a lot unless your muscles are contracting. But I think, like, if you're lying in bed for 8 hours a night, like, why don't we all just have like all of our lymphs in our backs? Like, what, it just doesn't make sense. Like, there's got to be more to it than that.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's fascinating. And yeah, just with lymphatic flow, like just so important for so very many things. So yeah, that's awesome.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's great. Well, I guess one question which you maybe already touched on a little bit just when I was going through the outline of your Quanta Foundations course, in the water and electron section, you had the one section that's entitled Connective Tissue Superhighway, which now I have more insight into that, I think, based on what you said about folks feeling stiffness and whatnot. But is there more around, like, could you just maybe explain why there's
I could,
that
yeah,
subject there?
I've taught entire workshops on this topic because it's so cool, right? It's so cool. So in all of my studies of anatomy, whenever I was taught to maybe dissect something, it was always, hey, that's like connective tissue or fascia, cut away at that so that we can see the kidney, or cut away at that so we can see like supposedly a more important structure.
Mm-hmm.
And what I recognize with all of this is that this connective tissue, it's everywhere, top to bottom. And not only does it stay outside of the cells, but it kind of forms more finer and finer matrices or webbing, if you will. So it goes from these big bands of fascia that maybe we can feel on the side of our leg or in our low back, to then at the outside of the cell, it's part of the extracellular matrix. It goes through the cell via something called an integrin or an integral membrane protein or a transmembrane protein. And then inside of the cell, it becomes the cytoskeleton. It can go into the nucleus. It becomes the nuclear matrix. So again, this is an example of, we name it different things at different scales, but it's all the same stuff. And so basically we've got this webbing all throughout our bodies connecting the interior of every single cell and every organelle and every single cell all together. And it's a hydrophilic surface. So it's also surrounded by exclusion zone water. And one of the things that I didn't mention when I talked about exclusion zone water is that it's called exclusion zone because nothing can penetrate into it except electrons, photons, and phonons. So what that basically means is around this entire connective connective tissue network, we have this exclusion zone water that acts as a highway that we can funnel electrons anywhere they're needed. If they're depleted, we can funnel light where it's needed, which is the basis for oftentimes that's being paralleled to traditional Chinese medicine and the acupuncture meridians. And then we can also funnel vibrations. So we can it has a vibratory component, so we can distribute another form of wireless communication throughout the body. So this is where I'm looking at the body and I'm asking, okay, do we have enough exclusion zone water so that this highway is complete, right? Do we have a complete highway? And then is the highway intact? Or are we dealing with scars in certain areas, or just adhered fascia, tightened fascia, where, if we have someone who's sitting at a desk all day, right, and we see this kind of kyphotic forward head posture, and we recognize, wait, their connective tissue is actually getting really dense in the back and creating these adhesions because it's trying to pull their head back on top of their shoulders. But as the fascia lays down new tracks, it's not as hydrated. It's kind of disorganized, not as beautifully aligned. And so that's another thing I think of. It's like, wait, we do know that there's a lack of electrical conductivity when the fascia is dehydrated. So that means if my fascia in the back there is lacking exclusion zone water, I've almost got a roadblock where I can't funnel energy and information. I can't funnel electrons and information to specific parts of the body. And so that's what I really go into when I talk about the quantum connective tissue superhighway. It's this ability, this interconnected web where we can send energy and information.
I can see why it can be like an entire course just on that topic. Could you define for us / for me, because I have no idea, I've never heard this word before. What is a phonon?
Oh, it's sound. It's sound.
Oh, okay. Oh, sound waves. Oh, cool.
Yeah,
Okay. I've heard of those,
absolutely.
but not by that name. Okay. Oh,
Sure.
very, very cool. Okay. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'd like to go down that rabbit hole a little bit more, but I
I
really
know,
need to
I
keep
hear
it a
you.
little. We're not going to get through all this material. I'm making terrible time on my list of questions here. So I think at this point, my assumption is folks listening are going to be chomping at the bit, saying, "Okay, like I get it. Easy water is incredibly important.
It's very
Without
important.
this, like all life will end." So could you please speak to how we can enhance, like just on a general level, like how can we enhance easy water in our bodies, and how what are some things that might interfere with easy water formation?
That's obviously what people are wanting to hear right now. But just so you know, I mean, rigor mortis, right? Like zero easy water,
Yeah, touche.
ultimate tissue stiffness.
Touche.
So what we're thinking here, so what we now know is that this exclusion zone water can kind of charge itself up or expand based on the application of some key wavelengths of light. So as I mentioned before, we can kind of divide light through a prism, and we see different colors. And the fancy way to say that would be kind of each of those colors has a different wavelength range to it. And it just so happens that a specific wavelength range just outside of what our eyes can see, called infrared, is what charges up our exclusion zone water. It'll expand it. So if we're depleted and we apply infrared, and you can use these two words synonymously, light or heat. I'll use them interchangeably, because some of the infrared our body physically perceives as heat, some of it our body doesn't, but it's all light basically we can't see. So this infrared light or infrared heat, when we apply it to areas that are depleted in exclusion zone water, you actually see up to or more than a 4-fold expansion. So we charge up that exclusion zone water. And this is really important because these days, living a modern lifestyle, number one, we're indoors most of the time, and we're under artificial light. So being under artificial light, unlike the sun, artificial light has zero infrared. Right? We've made our light bulbs very energy efficient for the building, but it's zero infrared to charge up one of our own energy sources inside of us. So while the sun contains, upwards of 40 to 50% infrared, indoors we're not getting it. And then secondarily, window glass, again, to make our indoor living more energy efficient, window glass blocks almost all of the infrared as well. So being indoors, we're very, very infrared deficient. And hence why either I encourage my clients to go outside to get what I call like these easy water recharges, or a lot of times they have to supplement with a sauna, a panel, something like that. But, dealing with, it's a fine line, because dealing with clients who may not be able to truly use a sauna the way they think they should, I have to convince them that it's like, no, you don't have to get in there to where you're going to be in there for 40 minutes and feel like crap for, pardon my language, crap for like the next week, right? Because you've maybe overdone and released some sort of a toxin in a blocked pathway that your body can't clear. You're just going in there for 5 minutes to get the infrared. It soaks right into that water network of your body, and it'll expand that exclusion zone water. So applying infrared can be a really key strategy to expand that battery, that expand that exclusion zone water. And then being aware, and I hate to say this, right, because technology is what's connecting us, but wireless wearable technology, especially wireless radiation, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, let's put it in simple terms, those have been shown to deplete and really decrease exclusion zone water. So again, a typical indoor environment where we might be right next to our Wi-Fi router all day on a computer with wireless, mouse and keyboard and monitor, and have our cell phone, and maybe I'm wearing wireless headset or a watch. All of those things can really destroy exclusion zone water. So it's kind of like this combination of let's see what we can do to reduce our exposure to those things, plus support infrared for the body.
That's great. And maybe just a connection to draw for folks, because, there's some, several sort of health experts out there in the realm of, complex chronic illness who talk about how, you really got to minimize Wi-Fi exposure. And some patients will come to me and say, I shut off my Wi-Fi. I got rid of all my wearable Wi-Fi devices, this and the other thing. I don't have a smart meter anymore, like whatever it is. And I don't really feel any different. Whereas other patients are like, oh my gosh, that made all the difference in the world. And I mean, from my perspective, and please let me know if your perspective on this differs, but I think maybe for some folks, maybe the ones who feel a lot better when they do that, maybe they had just too many other factors that were inhibiting their ability to make easy water. And then it was just the Wi-Fi was the straw that broke the camel's back. Whereas the folks who didn't really feel much different, maybe they still have enough easy water kicking around that they're not really noticing an obvious difference when they shut those things off. So, take home message would be all of us should probably try to minimize those non-native EMFs as much as possible, these like artificial EMFs, but maybe that's why some people feel better without the exposure and some people don't. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's very likely. That's a high possibility. No one's studying that, so it's kind of just basically going on our observations. So I think of it either as what's happening with exclusion zone water or what's happening at the level of the mitochondria themselves. Mm-hmm. Because those non-native EMFs, a different rabbit hole, can kind of change intracellular signaling to make it very chaotic to both inside of the cell and to the mitochondria. And so I think that's another thing too. Some people have more sensitivity to that to kind of form what's called a cell danger response. And some of it depends on is your cell already undergoing things that might be creating a danger response? And then you add these non-native EMFs to it, and it just massively creates even more chaos in the cell. And so it's nuanced with that, I totally agree with you. It kind of depends on where someone is at with their threshold. And sometimes non-native EMFs, because they've maybe cleared an intracellular pathogen, non-native EMFs are enough to really, if you get rid of those, you're allowed to really calm that cell danger response and all of a sudden be like, oh, my body can finally have the energetic capacity to heal.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and going down that rabbit hole of what impact do non-native EMFs have on mitochondrial function. It's like, oh man, just you read that alone, it's like, oh, maybe I'll just go live out in the woods, far away from any cell towers. But
I tell my clients it's a fine line between knowledge and fear, because mitochondria are responsive to fear as well, so they'll shut down function based on fear. So it's like, okay, I'm aware of this. So now I'm making specific decisions to take off my wearable watch, not use my cell phone on my head, things like that, right? I've got the old school, my kids call it, you got the really old school setup with your workstation with the wired everything. Mm-hmm. But it's like, okay, so with that knowledge, I made some changes, but I'm not fearful of the fact that I'm going to be walking by a cell phone tower on my walk this morning. We have to really balance that out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And with some of the things you've talked about today and other things you've talked about on your social media posts and in your course, I'm sure there's things you can do to kind of fight back, if you will. So if you're like, yeah, I'm going to be around EMFs, it's just going to be a fact of life for most of us. Right. But yeah, we can bolster, kind of bulletproof our bodies, so to speak, or EMF proof our bodies, maybe in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, and just for listeners, if you check out Carrie's Instagram profile, are you mostly on Instagram or are you on other
Well,
platforms too?
Instagram is my main social media
Yeah.
place. So that's
Okay.
if this is interesting to you, go there because there's like 1,000 posts you can dive into. And then I am now finally launching my new website, carriebwellness.com. So
Great.
that'll be another place for you to go to if you're
Okay.
interested in this. And so
Perfect. So yeah, I was gonna say, if you go on Carrie's Instagram, like she has several posts, like just in the last, I don't know, month or so, where if you want other ideas for like, oh, how can I enhance my easy water production, or what might be hindering it? Like, there's other things on there too, which I wish we had more time because I'd like to get into that, but no, we're starting to wind down here, and there's a few other broader topics I like to touch on first. So,
sure.
but thanks for all this so far. It's been great. Um, so let me see here. Right. So you have the third or sorry, the I guess maybe the fourth section of your Quantum Foundations course is about mitochondrial healing, which is near and dear to my heart, as you kind of alluded to. I'm a big mitochondrial junkie, a mitochondriac, as some would say.
Yep.
And so one of the subsections of your mitochondrial section is quote unquote mitochondrial support supplements. And so would you mind just kind of speaking to that section a little bit? Which ones seem to be the most important in your experience?
Yeah, sure. So there's other supplements that I think that when I view the body from a quantum perspective, I try to kind of key in on supplements that don't necessarily work at the level of true biochemistry. They kind of have more of a profound impact on electrons and protons, if you will. And
Hmm.
so the two that I key in on there are methylene blue and molecular hydrogen. I really think that those can be of massive benefit to people. As we talked about earlier, methylene blue works really well with light, specifically red and infrared light, UV light. So I've often had clients use methylene blue because methylene blue, and I don't know if you've talked with other people about it on your podcast, but it actually can, if our electron transport chain, which is where mitochondria make both water and ATP. So they basically make exclusion zone water and ATP for us. If that's broken, methylene blue can stand in as a surrogate. Like if any of the machines on that transport chain are broken, methylene blue can act in as a surrogate. Methylene blue can donate electrons to it if it's needed. Methylene blue can really help to clear out nitric oxide, which can bog down the chain. And so methylene blue is cool because it really facilitates that electron flow. It really facilitates mitochondrial health. And so I love that as an option for people. And I also like molecular hydrogen because it's a selective antioxidant in that I think for a long time we hear about things called oxidants or reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species. We hear about these things as being bad. So mitochondria make reactive oxygen species, and that's somehow bad. But what we now know, it's more nuanced than that. These oxidants are signaling. They're signaling things, right? They're actually biophotonic signaling. They're light signaling, and so through this biophoton signaling, they're signaling to the membrane about certain, maybe different receptor activity on the membrane. They're signaling to the DNA about gene expression. And so something we used to think we have to do is calm all of these oxidative species. And when we actually suppress them too much, we actually see harm, right? There was one study that really tipped me off in smokers where they tried to really calm all of this oxidation in smokers, and these smokers that actually received this therapy ended up dying and having worse outcomes. And so they had to stop the study early. And I was like, wait a second. And so that's where you have to recognize we want some of this signaling so that a cell can properly say, hey, immune system, we need a little support here, or the DNA can change and modify and produce certain proteins and molecules that we might need to support whatever the cell is, whatever happening in the cell. So we need some of that signaling, but excessive signaling is where all of a sudden we start to crash into a membrane, and all the time we create what's called like this lipid oxidation or peroxidation, and these cascades of inflammation. And so molecular hydrogen kind of calms the signaling if it's over exuberant, still allowing the message to get through, but doesn't necessarily suppress it to the extent where we have to worry about it, like we were talking about with that other study with the smokers. So it's a good one for clients who are either in high non-native EMF environments where they're always going to get a little bit more of that oxidative stress, and or someone, again, maybe dealing with oftentimes intracellular, right? An intracellular something that's creating intracellular oxidation. We want to calm it a little bit, but make the immune system still recognize that something's happening here and it still needs support.
Great. That's also very well said. I think you've done this before, Carrie, if I had to guess.
I like talking about this stuff, Brian. I think
I can
it's
tell.
cool.
Yeah. Given that you have so many courses on all these topics too, I'm thinking like, I'm going to be doing some CE through your website soon, I think. Um, so just a couple of questions about the methylene blue and hydrogen, because both topics I'm very fascinated by, and just maybe a little rapid fire because I know we don't have much time left. So with the methylene blue, from what your clients have told you or what you've observed otherwise, does sublingual methylene blue seem to work better than just regular capsules of methylene blue in your experience? Any difference there?
Yeah, I actually find liquid methylene blue that goes into the stomach, because in order for methylene blue to become an electron donor, it has to be reduced. It has to gain electrons, and it does that in an acidic environment. And so the acidic environment of the stomach actually allows it to work a lot better.
Hmm.
An indication for me that a client has low stomach acid actually is if that methylene blue goes in and it goes right out super dark blue in their urine, because it's like their body actually wasn't able to reduce it and then deliver it to where it was needed in the tissues, because we all have some use of methylene blue.
Sure.
And so that's one. And oftentimes I've actually had other clinicians, not, I haven't done this in my clinic at all, but I've had other clinicians use ascorbic acid or something that actually is an acid to donor, an electron donor, basically to help the methylene blue do its job.
Hmm.
I find that the level in the mouth, even though people say that it's a better proximity to the brain, I find that not to be the case. I don't think that it's beneficial. It might be beneficial for someone maybe not dealing with a complex chronic illness to do maybe a sublingual, but for people who are dealing with it and they need a lot of that reduced methylene blue, stomach is the way to go.
Okay. Oh, that's fascinating. Sorry, just taking a quick note
Yeah,
here.
yeah, sure.
All right. Trying to type with one hand. Not very.
That's talent.
What's that, sorry?
So that's a talent right there, you got.
Yeah, well, yeah, still working on that talent. So when you say liquid, because I'm just thinking like liquid methylene blue equals like blue teeth for the rest of your life. So you're talking about like it has to be in a liquid ahead of time, or can it be capsules that open up in the stomach and mix with your stomach juices?
I'm sure it can be capsules. I've never played around with capsules. I vetted one brand called Compass Laboratories USP 1% methylene blue, and that's the one that I recommend to my clients when we're dealing with this. And the way that the way I typically have them dose it is first thing in the morning, empty stomach, and it's like maybe 2 ounces of water. So you put in the dose and you down it back, and it's actually way less staining than if it's just has to dissolve, like either under the tongue or
For sure.
in the
Could
cheek,
imagine.
right? That's
Yeah. Super stainy. Yeah.
yeah, super staining.
You can always tell the methylene blue junkies at the conferences is like their mouths are stained. It's
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I don't know. Anyways, I have mixed feelings about it, but that's good to know. And then with the hydrogen, which is another really fascinating topic, and like I find not very many people talk about it, even though there's been so many human clinical trials with hydrogen therapy. In your experience, is it okay if it's like the tablets that dissolve in water and create the hydrogen gas? Does it need to be hydrogenated water, like with a hydrogen gas making machine on the spot? Does it have to be inhaled hydrogen? Like, what clinical application have you seen to be effective?
I mean, all those are effective, but typically I have clients who just, because there's other things, there's a cost barrier to a lot of that other stuff. So I typically just have clients start off with the tablets in water. And as long as we're starting with a pure glass of water, right? I don't necessarily want to have tap water and toxins ingested with this. If people understand that what they're drinking is the bubbles, right? Drink the gas that's being produced. If you can do that within the window of time, which is anywhere between like 1 to 2 minutes, then you're going to get the therapeutic effect. Because just like sunlight kind of kicks off cascades, molecular hydrogen does the same thing. It doesn't have to, we don't need to have it all the time. It's just kicking off almost like an immune system awareness, or it's kicking off an antioxidant awareness in the body to kind of go to work. And so you just need to capture it and give it that signal for it to do its thing.
Okay. And is there a particular brand of hydrogen tablets you found to be more effective than others, or kind of a go-to?
I've actually seen all the brands that I've tried, I've actually seen efficacy. So HRW, hydrogen rich water, is one. Quicksilver Scientific is another. Mercola brand is another. A client just came across another brand that I can't think of that was an Australian brand that actually is working just fine. So yeah, I think now that the technology is understood, and you want to reach a certain threshold of parts per million in a certain amount of time while that gas is bubbling. I think if you can capture that, then you're okay.
Okay, great. Well, just with the last minute or so that we have left here, Carrie, and I wish I could pick your brain for twice as long because I still have a whole laundry list of questions here. So just kind of tying all this into complex chronic illness. So, folks dealing with like mold toxicity, chronic Lyme disease, heavy metal accumulation, mast cell activation syndrome, like lots of stuff going on.
Sure.
A lot of these folks, depending on the clinician they're working with, they might be on like really, really elaborate protocols, treating multiple therapeutic targets at once.
Sure.
I guess from my point of view as a clinician, the way I kind of think about these types of things we've talked about today is, if we're implementing some of these changes, and thankfully a lot of them are lifestyle changes, a couple of them are supplements we've talked about, but a lot of them are, like things that are free, like going and being exposed to the sun or whatnot, or, trying to minimize EMF exposure. I look at these things as being sort of enhancements to their protocol, that if you're doing these things / avoiding this or that, then it's probably going to help to heal, but help them along the way with their healing journey faster. Is that kind of roughly how you perceive it as well, or is there a different take that you have on it?
No, that's beautiful. That's exactly it, Brian. So like I also teach a certification program in this for practitioners, and we get practitioners from all sorts of angles, whether some of them we've had dentists, we've had physical therapists, MDs, NDs, DCs, DOs, nutritionists, and it's like everyone is looking to support what they currently do. So we all have some sort of tools in our toolbox to assist, especially complex chronic illness, because it's called complex chronic illness for a reason, right? And so there is a lot of sometimes detective work that needs to be done. But what I am seeing is that when we help people recognize that light is a signal, light will help their hormones and their other signals and all these things that we're trying to do with other lifestyle and nutrition and supplement changes. Light enhances that during the day when we get the right signaling, and darkness enhances it at night. So making sure the body knows, oh, now's the time to regenerate. All that stuff, all those supplements that Carrie gave me to regenerate, now's the time to do that, right? And so that, I think, is really, really key. Yes, this is kind of a foundation upon which you can do your amazing work that you do, Brian, and then just give people a couple extra tools to help facilitate healing at a faster pace.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do, Carrie. This has been really a great conversation, and I'm really excited to tell all my folks on my newsletter and on my social media following and all that. Just I'm really excited to promote this interview. It's been great. We've already talked about where folks can find you on Instagram, your pending website. I'll put those links in the show notes. Are there any other things that folks should know about where they can access you, or anything else that you have going on?
That's great. No, those are the two places that I really am most often. So just connect with me in any way you can. And if you have any questions, like just start, right? Just start applying light. Don't overthink it. Just go outside and see if you can sync up to those signals and see how your body feels. So
awesome. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. Really appreciate your time. And thanks so much to everyone for tuning in. This concludes another episode of the Overcoming Chronic Illness podcast. So thanks for your attention, and talk to you next time.